Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting radio-exclusive offer just for you. For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just text WATER to 64,000. That's WATER to 64,000 for your 2 free gifts with purchase. WATER to 64,000.
By texting 64,000, you agree to receive recurring automated marketing messages from Pocket Hose. Message and data rates may apply. No purchase required. Terms apply. Available at pockethose.com/terms.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Laszlo Montgomery here with another China History Podcast episode. By the time this one reaches your podcast feeds, it'll be right around the actual 15-year anniversary of the launch of this long-running family program. Since June 2010, you've been such a lovely audience. With all the recent talk about the USA having its Cultural Revolution moment, well, I was inspired to release another episode covering that period of time. There have been so many parallels drawn between the 10 years of chaos in China from 1966 to 1976 with what's going on right now in these United States. Yeah, it's not hard to cherry pick a bunch of things that might lead one to believe this is the case, that America is now going through a similar kind of moment in its history. It's all very interesting, and some could use the GPCR, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, as a cutout to point to in order to mock or heap scorn on the behavior and actions of the current administration in power. To compare America's cultural divide, the coast-to-coast rancor and acrimony being spewed out in 10,000 directions, to compare what's going on here right now with the events that happened in China beginning in August 1966, it's quite a stretch and sort of trivializes what went down nationwide in China during the real GPCR. We're going to look at one of the most horrific yet lesser-known events, and if society and the beautiful country as we know it today should ever fall this low to the depths that I'm going to present over the next hour, then I'll be sold on the notion that we're experiencing in real time the USA's Cultural Revolution moment. Today, I only want to focus on one part of China that doesn't grab the headlines that it should. We're only going to look at the province of Guangxi today and the years 1966 to 1968 in specific. The title of this episode is the Guangxi Massacre. In Chinese, it's called the Guangxi Datusha. This was one of those things that happened throughout history where so many people died who weren't accounted for that we could only estimate the number of deaths, let alone the number of eternally traumatized survivors. 100,000, 150,000 dead, 75,000. Scholars can disagree on the high and low estimates of the fatalities in Guangxi during that 2-year period, but it was a lot of people. And it wasn't just that so many people were killed in one province during such a short period of time. It was the manner in which they were killed. People who got beat up, degraded, and killed. Standard GPCR stuff. We've seen the photos, archival films, and scenes from movies. We know what happened. Some of you went through it yourselves or were directly impacted by it. And this is no Lin Biao incident where we've been left to speculate for more than half a century about the details. The Guangxi Datusha, It's very well documented. There's such a broad spectrum of opinions throughout the public discourse concerning the Communist Party, but there's one thing no one can deny. They know how to carry out an investigation, and no detail is ever too insignificant to be left out. As far as those years that ended in 1976, after the July 28th Tangshan earthquake, and 43 days later after Mao died, the PRC got to breathe a sigh of relief. China's GDP in 1976 was less than half of Elon Musk's net worth as of 10 minutes ago. And today it's what, 17-something trillion dollars? Comeback of the epoch. Many of us back in the early 1980s who kept up with the meager amount of news and information about China available back then remember after Deng Xiaoping came to power, there was a day of judgment in China. After Hua Guofeng and his two whatevers went down in flames at the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, December 1978, then at the sixth plenum, June 27 to 29, 1981, the document entitled Resolution on Certain Questions in the History of Our Party Since the Founding of the People's Republic of China. That document gave the verdict, and it was Deng himself who said the words that Mao, in his last 5 years of life, feared most of all. Deng said, quote, "The Cultural Revolution, which lasted from May 1966 to October 1976, was responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the state, and the people since the founding of the People's Republic. It was initiated and led by Comrade Mao Zedong." End quote. So after the dust had settled and Deng was firmly in power, though kept in check by the conservatives led by Chen Yun, it was agreed that it wouldn't be a bad idea to look into certain matters related to the Cultural Revolution. This idea was spawned in the spirit of this new Bo Luan Fan Zheng, eliminating chaos and returning to normal policy that Deng had been calling for as soon as Mao was gone and the Gang of Four and their allies overthrown. So in 1981, the deciders in Beijing sent investigative teams down to Guangxi to start poking their noses around to look into all these horrible allegations that had happened and to verify rumors concerning certain atrocities committed. And when they went down to the Guangxi capital of Nanning and made inquiries into certain matters, well, there was enough obfuscation, non-answers, and suspicious replies to indicate a massive cover-up was being perpetrated. So this group, they went back to Beijing and reported their findings to the Politburo. So the party center in 1983 and 1984 sent two groups of investigators down to Guangxi to go have a look-see and get to the bottom of this. And among the roughly 100 officials sent down to Guangxi with Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang's blessing were Xi Chongxun, father to China's current leader. They organized over 100,000 investigators to visit every city, prefecture, county, town, and village and talk to the people directly. Guangxi officials had already shown their unwillingness to be forthcoming, so they were shunted aside, and the party center took control. You couldn't play games with those guys. And the findings were published in 1987 and 1988. 18 volumes. It was pretty explosive stuff. A lot of material was later deleted from the report because it was feared if any of this got leaked, which it did, the blowback might be terribly embarrassing to the party, as if the whole Cultural Revolution wasn't bad enough. Well, Chinese author and dissident Zheng Yi, he carried out his own investigation and published his findings in a 1993 book called Hongse Jinianbei. The English title was a bit more provocative, Scarlet Memorial, Tales of Cannibalism in Modern China. Well, with a title like that, as well as the information Zheng Yi uncovered, it was all rather suspect. Zheng Yi was a former Tsinghua Red Guard, and he had gone down to Guangxi himself back in 1968. Then he went back again in 1986 to carry out his own investigation. And he later went on to participate in the 1989 Tiananmen student protests. He had a bone to pick with the party, and his book received a lot of praise as well as condemnation. And some said he overdid it with the cannibalism part, but for shock value and moral horror, cannibalism is some potent clickbait, man. Two other sources that came in handy were UC Irvine professor of sociology Su Yang's book on the Guangxi Massacre called Collective Killings in Rural China During the Cultural Revolution. The other main source that contained a feast of details culled from CCP investigations is Stanford professor Andrew G. Walder's 2023 book entitled Civil War in Guangxi, The Cultural Revolution on China's Southern Periphery. I heard Dr. Walder on Marshall Poe's New Books Network and went out and got that book right away. This being a long-running family program and all, I'm not going to turn this episode into a gore fest. But for anyone whose interest was piqued by this episode, I strongly encourage you to turn to these sources in particular. Cultural Revolution scholar and former Red Guard Song Yong-yi was able to publish his compilation of the government's investigative report called The Secret Archives About the Cultural Revolution in Guangxi, Guangxi Wen革機密檔案資料. After it got leaked, the report was published in 2016 in 36 volumes, with 10 more that came out the following year, and each volume weighing in at around 300 to 500 pages. There was also an article written by Carnegie Mellon professor emeritus Donald S. Sutton called Consuming Counter-Revolution, The Ritual and Culture of Cannibalism in Wuxuan, Guangxi, China. Wuxuan is a county in Guangxi located about midway between Liuzhou and Nanning. The worst acts of cannibalism happened there. What's interesting and different about this topic is that for most of the Cultural Revolution narratives heard in popular Chinese history, the stories usually concern what happened in the major cities and at the pinnacles of power in the party and the PLA. Well, this story we're looking at today, took place off the beaten path in Guangxi. This history was mostly written by rank-and-file Laobaixing workers, students, peasants, and rural militias and paramilitary forces. So let's get down on it. May 16th, 1966, while the Fab Four were in the studio recording Revolver, Mao Zedong released the Wu Yiliu Tongzhi. This May 16th notification caused top party leaders and comrades from the old guard to sit up and take notice, though not specifically named. Anyone with a Mao decoder ring knew from the language of this document who was in Mao's crosshairs. But that wasn't all. Mao also called upon the masses to rise up and smash capitalist roaders. That's where he lit the fuse, and by June, the fireworks and explosions started happening with daily frequency. Besides the A-listers from Beijing, the main characters of this episode were, I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm guessing they're not terribly well known by many of you. Starring in the lead role was Wei Guoqing. By all accounts, someone like Wei Guoqing should have been one of the first ones to topple and get plowed under by Red Guards. Wei Guoqing was born September 2nd, 1913, sharing a birthday with Keanu Reeves. He was an ethnic Zhuang, born and raised in poverty, joined the Red Army in 1929 and the party 2 years later. He ended up on Jinggangshan with Mao and his band of brothers and saw plenty of action courtesy of Chiang Kai-shek. He fled Jinggangshan with Mao and the rest of the survivors and participated in the Long March, and he fought in the Chinese Civil War. Yeah, you could say Wei Guoqing, for all of that, he was practically a poster boy waiting to be airplaned, humiliated, and violently struggled against. But there were a couple things about Wei Guoqing that prevented that from happening. He was the only provincial leader who didn't get overthrown in the Cultural Revolution. We'll get to that in a bit, but I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the map of Guangxi. So he was the main guy. The other major figure from this saga was Wu Jinnan. In Guangxi, Wei Guoqing ranked first in the party, Wu Jinan ranked second. And his CV reads just like Wei Guoqing's. Joined the party in his teens, saw action in all the big moments in PRC military history, and served the party impeccably as a military leader. He wasn't a Zhuang. He wasn't even from Guangxi. He came from Guangdong Province, Xingning County, just west of the Hakka homeland of Meizhou. I won't get into the events that followed Mao's May 16th notification. I don't want Drew Smith calling me in the middle of the night, telling me to stay in my lane. In June and July of 1966, the Red Guards emerged and started killing, maiming, and physically attacking and scarring for life class enemies and capitalist roaders. Schools and universities began shutting down, and then came the famous moment, August 5th, 1966. Mao blows his trumpet and declares, "Pao da Si Ling Bu," bombard the headquarters. And as a harbinger of the madness to follow, also on that same day, August 5th, 1966, the vice principal of a high school in Beijing, attended by the children of party leaders, was beaten to death for her counter-revolutionary crimes. And among her tormentors and killers were the two daughters of Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi. Wei Guoqing and the old Guangxi party leadership were in the same leaky and sinking boat as everyone else in China in their high-ranking position. No one knew with certainty where Mao was going to take this. Many, like Wei Guoqing, chose to follow the lead of poor old Beijing Party Secretary Peng Zhen and everyone else who thought like him. Wei and his fellow conservatives got called out for their faux enthusiasm of Chairman Mao and their faux zeal of the students and the masses, and they fell into Mao's trap, earning the chairman's ire, and found themselves on their own to defend against the leftists calling for their heads. In Guangxi, it all began in the tourist paradise of Guilin at Guangxi Normal College. The administration there was being attacked so forcefully they had to assemble their own Scarlet Guards, they called them, to protect them from physical harm. Wei tried to push back on the direction things were going and tried to tell the rebels to cool it. But this just infuriated the student leaders, and they petitioned the powers that be in Beijing and accused the leadership down in Guangxi of the whole laundry list of revisionist, anti-party, anti-Chairman Mao crimes, and the focus of their outrage was Wei Guoqing. They were demanding self-criticism, struggle sessions, and dismissal from his post. Wei, to placate the most vociferous of the factions, sacrificed a few lambs who they put through the Wenke ringer. Lambs they were, though very high-ranking lambs, but alas, they were not him. Wei Guoqing saw how these officials got manhandled, and, well, he didn't like it and made it known publicly that the students had gone too far with injuries they inflicted on these officials. And this, of course, further inflamed the students. And not only that, he was going against what Chairman Mao was clearly articulating in his speeches and big character posters. At this stage, in the summer of 1966, everyone on the left, the more radical among them, were only testing their wings, seeing how high and how fast they could fly. Chairman Mao had been so forceful and yet so ambiguous. So down in Guangxi, and elsewhere for sure, with no guardrails in place yet, some of the most outrageous acts of violence and destruction started happening. Wei Guoqing was still the top guy and therefore under fire constantly. Somehow he had managed to dodge the protesters who were constantly plotting how to corner him and smack him around a little. He did make appearances, though. At one event, he went into the crowd, apparently to help someone who had fallen to the ground, and then he himself was attacked. Well, the reports sent to Beijing indicated his wounds were more severe than they actually were, and the attack more brutal than it was. This wasn't the first falsified or exaggerated report to be sent up the chain of command. Into 1966, the chaos fed on itself, and Wei Guoqing tried to hold the fort down. He and his allies were fighting for their political and physical survival by the end of the year. And with Mao backing the students and rebels to the hilt, well, no one could fight back. And anyone who thought this would fizzle out after a while were sorely disappointed. By December 1966, Liu Shaoqi had just been placed under house arrest, and Jiang Qing had just had her fun with Wang Guangmei. Finally, in January 1967, Wei Guoqing was tracked down, dragged onto a stage, and his struggle session became the evening entertainment in Nanning. He was beaten senseless along with other high-ups, which left the Guangxi party leadership without a leader. A rudderless top party leadership at the provincial level wasn't just happening down in Guangxi. January 1967 was when all the power seizures were happening in China. The one that occurred in Nanning on January 22nd, 1967, was immediately handicapped with the emergence of dozens of factions wanting to take things in different directions. And this further added complexities to an increasingly out-of-control situation. It was a poorly organized and executed seizure that ended up getting botched due to intra-factional strife. A lot of people got a free education in the difference between seizing power and leading a government. On February 2nd, Wang Li from the CCRG, the Central Cultural Revolution Group, came down to Nanning to try and sort things out. But all along, and he'll get roasted by Chairman Mao for this later on, though tasked with mediating between the growing number of factions, even before he got there, he was looking to undermine Wei Guoqing and his allies and sweep the leftist factions to power. So March 21st, 1967, a pivotal moment in Guangxi, with the Cultural Revolution already sailing to infinity and beyond. After a few disturbing reports about what was going down in Guangxi, Mao wisely decided some semblance of order needed to be restored, and the Guangxi military district of the PLA needed to be called in to referee all the parties collectively making revolution. So Mao needed to choose someone to head this up, this highest military post in the province. The Guangxi military district had control over not only the entire arsenal of weapons in Guangxi, but over the entire military apparatus down to the individual rural militias. Well, this didn't make headline news in the popular discourse of the Cultural Revolution, but it exploded like a Tsar Bomba when the people down in Guangxi heard it. Mao decided to go with Wei Guoqing to head up the Guangxi military district. Wei had been under relentless attack since Mao fired the starting gun back in May 1966. His political enemies had come after him hard and violently. As I said, he was a walking, talking model of the kind of party leaders who had been branded revisionists. Even worse, from day one, he clearly exhibited a lukewarm enthusiasm for the Cultural Revolution. He had tried to tamp down whatever fires the students and workers tried to start. This late in the first quarter, a lot of people were asking, how was it that Wei Guoqing was still standing? So he was put in charge of the army. Chairman Mao didn't tell anyone to take it easy, but with the military now in the hands of the blood enemy of the left rebel factions in Nanning, Guilin, and Liuzhou, and elsewhere, the optics of this looked terrible. This set in motion a series of events that led all contending factions to coalesce around two factions who battled for control of the Cultural Revolution in Guangxi. The first one was called the Lianzhi, or Nanning Region Proletarian Revolutionary Allied Command. It was also simply called the Allied Command, or Headquarters. It was also called the Big Faction. This one supported Wei Guoqing and all that he stood for. The other was the April 22nd Headquarters, or CRR, and their leader was Wu Jinnan, former number 2 party boss in Guangxi. It became known as 422 because the organization formed on April 22nd, 1967, in the wake of the violent protests that followed the announcement of Wei as the head of the Guangxi military district. This was also called the Small Faction. And with these battle lines drawn, the civil war in Guangxi began. If you recall your GPCR history, you'll know in the summer of 1967, right after Sgt. Pepper's came out, Mao had been unwavering in his support for the Red Guards and the leftist students and workers. He wasn't happy how things were going, but he was far from backpedaling. And the 422 faction was feeling quite sanguine about their future prospects that when this whole upheaval ran its course, they would end up prevailing. But remember, as I said, there was one thing working in Wei Guoqing's favor that made him untouchable. Not only did he have this admirable resume and background, born and raised in Guangxi, and with ethnic minority street cred, being what was referred to as a Sinicized Zhuang notwithstanding, he had one other important thing about him. After the founding of the People's Republic in October 1949, Wei Guoqing became China's chief liaison with the Viet Minh. With a 724-kilometer-long border between Guangxi and North Vietnam, well, you can imagine how convenient that was as far as transporting arms, materiel, and support for Ho Chi Minh. Wei Guoqing was based in Vietnam from 1950 to 1955. He helped the Viet Minh beat the French at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954 and attended the Geneva Conference along with Zhou Enlai. And it was upon his return to Guangxi in 1955 that Wei Guoqing was made the governor of the province. 3 years later, the province was renamed the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, and Wei held that top position as well. So you could say, as far as China's relationship with the Vietnamese communists, Wei Guoqing was muy importante. And the reason all this matters is because the first American troops started arriving in Vietnam in March 1965, and there'd be 184,000 of them by the end of the year. In 1966, there were already 385,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. There were bombing campaigns going on in North Vietnam and regular violations of China's airspace by USAF jets. 1966, 67, 68, man, those were peak Vietnam War years. The U.S. was bombing right up to the Vietnam-China border. Guangxi was the staging area for all this materiel and support being sent by truck and by rail to the border. So this was something that concerned Mao quite a bit. He had called for the Resist America and Aid Vietnam campaign, Kang Mei Yuan Yue. Mao was going all out to do whatever he could to help his Vietnam comrades defeat the American imperialists. He stood up to the Yanks in Korea, and here was going to be a repeat performance. The Russians, China's former close comrade in arms, now turned revisionists, wanted Vietnam to settle with the U.S. and end the war. But Mao wanted Ho Chi Minh, Pham Van Dong, Lê Yuan, and Vo Nguyen Giap to taste the same victory he tasted. His support for the Vietnamese communists was unshakable. So all that considered, Wei Guoqing was necessary. And for such an important matter as this, something of national concern, Mao needed Wei and all of his personal relationships, connections, trust, and goodwill that he had built up going back to the Viet Minh days. Nothing could get in between the Viet Cong and total victory over America. So when Zhou Enlai rang Wei Guoqing on March 13, 1967, and told him for the sake of supporting Vietnam, they were putting him in charge, and to make sure nothing got in the way of the supply lines that ran from Liuzhou down to the border town of Pingxiang. And there, at Friendship Pass, the PRC fed the North Vietnamese war machine and assisted them in their monumental struggle against the U.S. military. Following face-to-face meetings with Zhou in Beijing, Wei returned to Guangxi and went on a serious charm offensive to win his detractors over to his side. And all the while, Wang Li was still working surreptitiously to undermine Wei and to support the 422 faction. When everything was made public about the selection of Wei Guoqing, there was a huge uproar. The way things worked, when the party center fired off a directive, everyone's supposed to follow it no matter what. That's called party discipline. But so loud was the outcry and defiance of having someone like Wei Guoqing put in charge that was anathema to what Mao had been calling for ever since he told everyone to bombard the headquarters. This was highly unusual, but now we know why. Throughout March and April, the two sides organized one demonstration after another, one side in support of Wei Guoqing, one side calling for his overthrow. There had been a few dozen rebel factions that were lined up against Wei. He was an extremely polarizing figure, and after several high-profile incidents, it became clear there was going to be no reconciling these two sides. Therefore, on April 30th, 1967, representatives were told to come to Beijing, and it would be in the capital that they would mediate a solution. Allied command, led by Wei, represented the status quo and the old guard. They sent their representatives, and the delegation of the 422 faction was led by Wu Jinnan. On June 1st, the two factions met with Zhou Enlai, who, if he didn't have enough problems already, had to referee this lost cause. This will be only the first of several meetings between Zhou and these two groups. On June 14th, alarm bells started going off in Beijing when word reached the top that due to factional conflict, train service between Liuzhou and the Vietnam border had been halted and arms seized. Now, it was okay to go out and demonstrate and carry out revolution and smash the four olds, but where the Vietnam War was concerned, that was a bit of a sacred cow, and no one was allowed to do anything that affected the flow of arms to China's ally. And everyone got a stern warning from Zhou Enlai not to ever do that again, or else. Into July, the talks continued. The April 22nd faction had the CCRG solidly in their corner, using all their power and influence to sway the decision in support of their rebel faction over Wei Guoqing. The negotiations dragged on into the hot Beijing summer. On August 9th, those in the 422, after trying and failing previously to snatch Wei Guoqing from his hotel room, were able to corner him. And he was severely beaten, Cultural Revolution style, and ended up being hospitalized until his injuries healed. The 422 activists had reason to act so boldly. They had the CCRG watching their back and all the while assuring them the party center was leaning in their direction over the Allied command revisionists. Every indication was that Premier Zhou was in lockstep with the CCRG in supporting the 422 faction. It took a while, but Wang Li, finally, by September 1967, had worn out his welcome with Chairman Mao. He and other CCRG colleagues were chastised for their meddling and secretly working against the party in the resolution of this Guangxi Wenti, or Guangxi problem as it was being called. The deal breaker for Mao was the relentless attacks against Guangxi military units of the PLA. Wang Li and colleagues Qi Banyu and Guan Feng were all arrested and taken out of the game, and with those three no longer being players, the 422 faction lost their most important allies in Beijing. Meanwhile, the talks in Beijing continued on at an agonizing pace. Not only Zhou, but Mao as well, was starting to tire of these two sides who refused to reconcile their differences. Let me quote from Andrew Walder's book when, quote, an exasperated Zhou Enlai had told the delegates in Beijing, Allied command, your actions just get more and more outrageous, always attacking others. There's no limit. April 22nd blocks shipments of military supplies for the support of Vietnam, and so much of this you've kept. You really didn't know that this was for Vietnam? April 22nd's behavior is totally wrong. Turn it all back in. Obey orders. If you want to defend yourselves, rely on the military district, and you, pointing to the Allied command delegates, are seizing all their strongholds. There are only 3 or so left. You still want to wipe them out? But that's impossible. If you keep this up, I'll get the military district to supply them with arms. Guangxi is on the front lines, close to Vietnam's rear. I ask you to think. Others are fighting American imperialism, and you're fighting a civil war. Neither of you has any conception of the threat from our enemies. You're completely clueless. By doing this, do you want the American imperialists to invade? Their planes flying over Nanning? We'll send you to the front lines to fight, and then you'll finally be forced to unite. End quote. Ooh, don't get Zhou Enlai mad. Under pressure to resolve their differences, a peace agreement was reluctantly signed in Beijing on November 8th. It called for all rebel groups to join together under Wei Guoqing. Mao said Wei had to stay. No negotiation on that. Wei Guoqing and Wu Jinnan both had to come out and do the whole self-criticism thing and admit to their roles in promoting factional conflict. It appeared that it was all over, but the reality was that all the representatives from Guangxi were saying yeah to the party leadership. Nothing had changed in their heart of hearts. And when they all returned to Guangxi to go set up this preparatory committee to form a new Nanning Revolutionary Committee, the fighting resumed as if that whole time in Beijing from May to November 1967 had never happened. Upon their return, the fighting and killing resumed. In the rural counties of Guangxi, local militias loyal to the Allied command but tasked with being neutral started bumping off 422 faction supporters. Wu Jinnan and other 422 leaders were in a very disadvantageous position with the military on the side of their bitter rival. All throughout the end of 1967, there was more and more civil strife, protests, demonstrations, and all-out warfare between the Allied command and 422 factions. It wasn't a fair fight. With greater numbers, the leadership in Beijing on their side, and being backed by the PLA, the Allied command fighters kept up constant pressure on 422 members. Meanwhile, the preparatory committee was getting nowhere in its task to establish a functioning government to be run by a revolutionary committee. The 422 leaders were holding rallies and sending petitions to get the Allied command to call off the militias who were doing all the killing in the rural areas of Guangxi. Into 1968, there was no let-up in the fighting and finger-pointing. The killings in the name of cleansing the class ranks continued, followed by protests condemning the violence. It was in January that the killings started to become more gruesome, reflecting the magnitude of the revenge being meted out against 422 members. And then, come February 1968, the Allied command faction began to turn the heat up a little more, going after not only 422 supporters, but class enemies and counter-revolutionaries, framing the 422 faction in the worst possible light, inferring they were anti-party in their actions and deeds. Besides that, in their reports to the head office in Beijing, the details were riddled with lies that purported the 422 rebels were engaging in acts that simply weren't true. This included attacks on officials and PLA units, cooperating with foreign agents, as well as ignoring orders from the party center. Allied command attacks on 422 faction members never let up for a second, and in fact, it started to increase. More reports were sent to Beijing by the Allied command, falsely accusing them of heinous crimes, sure to evoke a strong reaction. And this continued on into May and June of 1968. By this time, Mao and Zhou were so fed up with the failure of these two sides to stop their bickering, they were easily duped by all the reports claiming the April 22 faction was practically taking their orders from Chiang Kai-shek. April 22 sent a delegation to Beijing to protest the false reports and the unfair treatment at the hands of Allied command. Let me quote again from Andrew Walder. Quote, "The mass killings in counties, which had begun to spread in April and May 1968, accelerated in June. During that month, deaths at the hands of local authorities continued to spread. In June alone, 2 counties, Mengshan and Quanzhou, recorded more than 1,000 such killings. In 3 counties, there were more than 400, and in 8 counties, there were well over 100. The actual situation, completely obscured in Nanning's dispatches to Beijing, was one of intensifying massacres in rural counties, the arming and mobilization of a resurgent Allied command, and the flow of rural militias to fight factional battles in the cities." End quote. By the end of May, with all the reports being sent that insisted April 22 was carrying out all kinds of the worst possible anti-party acts, seizing weapons from PLA depots and conspiring to take over the government down there. In Nanning, Guilin, and Liuzhou, there were armed battles in the streets. On June 19th, Allied command fighters attacked 422 fighters holed up inside a building in the capital, Nanning. 62 of them were killed, and their bodies dumped into the Yong River that runs through the city. The government wasn't ordering these attacks, nor were they encouraged. But by the very nature of the Cultural Revolution and the kind of atmosphere that was created by Mao, the CCRG, and everyone else lined up with them, had a profound impact on the scale and nature of violence. It wasn't announced in writing, but as far as which people were killable, there were 4 types of class enemies who ended up on the receiving end: former landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, and bad elements. No matter their position on any issue, which faction, if any, they supported, were they even involved in any of the struggles? Didn't matter. They were targeted and put through the most awful ordeals. And just like the titles handed out by the former Zhou dynasty kings from 3,000 years ago, these class labels were hereditary. They came in handy quite often during the Cultural Revolution and for other mass campaigns. Those unfortunate to be tarred by this gigantic brush could always be used as fodder for local cadres trying to advance their party credentials or demonstrate their revolutionary zeal. On June 14, 1968, at the Liuzhou branch of the military district, officers there, sympathetic to Allied command, discussed their next moves. The one in charge declared that, quote, "The struggle against the enemy requires a Force 12 typhoon. The methods are mobilize the masses fully, depend on the dictatorship of the masses, hand over policy to the masses. In making class struggle, you cannot be gentle." End quote. Gee, what did that mean? Well, on the Beaufort scale, a Force 12, it's the strongest level of typhoon with wind speeds exceeding 74 plus miles per hour with 45 plus feet high waves. But in Cultural Revolution speak, it was a metaphor to describe extreme political movements or purges, signifying a massive, unstoppable ideological storm. If anyone uttered the words "Shi Typhoon," these Force 12 typhoons were used in cases where no holds barred extreme force was to be used, no matter the consequences. Words were spoken to the effect that assured the riled up masses that they wouldn't be arrested, interrogated, or suffer any legal consequences in carrying out these attacks against the class enemies. And at a time when the Allied command fighters were locked and loaded with PLA-supplied arms, after a year of lost sleep over this matter, Mao snapped from all the false reports and all his collective frustration and pulled the trigger on an order that became known as the Qisan Bugao, the July 3rd Order. This order contained the following unambiguous language from Mao. Quote, "In recent months, in Liuzhou, Guilin, Nanning Prefecture, a small handful of Khrushchev-type capitalist roaders inside the party and their representatives in Guangxi, along with traitors, secret agents, counter-revolutionary elements, and landlords, rich peasants, bad elements, and rightists, have deceived and fooled some of the masses and have repeatedly created a series of counter-revolutionary incidents. 1. Sabotaged railway transport, which has yet to be restored. 2. Daring to seize supplies for support of Vietnam and refusing to return them. 3. Repeatedly attacking the headquarters and troops of the People's Liberation Army, seizing the People's Liberation Army's arms and equipment, wounding and killing their officers and troops. The Center considers these acts to be counter-revolutionary crimes by a small group of class enemies of sabotaging the proletarian dictatorship, sabotaging the struggle to resist America and aid Vietnam, and sabotaging the proletarian cultural revolution." End quote. With the July 3rd Order reverberating all over Guangxi, along with thoughts of Force 12 typhoons, The force used against the surviving 422 members was swift and brutal. Allied command supporters, backed by PLA units, swept through the city of Nanning, searching for any surviving 422 supporters. All kinds of people completely unassociated with the 422 and not involved in the struggle themselves. If they got caught in the net, they were treated as if they were class enemies. On July 16th, again, 1968, 283 people were rounded up and 33 of them summarily executed. As for the other 250, who knows? The Allied command had the backing of the Guangxi military district of the PLA all the way down to the rural PADs, or People's Armed Departments, or Renmin Wuzhuangbu. The PADs, they weren't militias. They ran and administered the local militias, or Minbing. No matter in a county, a commune, the PADs had been most busy during the Cultural Revolution. Whoever controlled them controlled the ability to maintain order and favor one faction over another. They controlled these rural militias that were at the bottom, grassroots level of Guangxi society. And it was at the grassroots level where the worst atrocities took place in Guangxi. After the 422 had been wiped out in the urban areas, they were tracked down all throughout the counties. Over the course of the Cultural Revolution, in Guangxi and elsewhere, individual neighborhoods of cities and towns became affiliated with one faction or another. So after putting up so much resistance for such a long time, 422 fighters were hunted down to the last person. The two greatest battles to crush the remaining 422 members occurred in Nanning and Guilin. It took 3 weeks to decimate the last of the 422 fighters in Nanning. 1,600 deaths piled up during this period. Let me quote from Andrew Walder again, quote, "In the Liberation Road neighborhood, 680 corpses resulting from the fighting were eventually dumped into a coal pit, and a similar number were recovered from the burnt-out buildings. Another 72 were buried hastily along the banks of Chaoyang Creek. 52 were killed while trying to flee, and an unknown number of corpses floated off down the creek and into the Yong River. During the entire course of the Battle of Nanning, only 60 Allied command faction were killed, along with 26 PLA soldiers." End quote. 6,500 422s were taken prisoner, plus another 2,500 locals suspected of being 422 supporters were rounded up as well. Yeah, it was like the White Terror days of 1927 Shanghai. 2,224 ended up getting executed, 246 were jailed. Anyway, that was just in Nanning. The day back in March 1967, when the Party Center in Beijing, for reasons related to the Vietnam War, decided to put Wei Guoqing in charge of the Guangxi military district, it was already over for the 422 rebels. They had held out hopes that, with this powerful CCRG backing, it would ensure they prevailed over the Allied command faction. But it wasn't meant to be. Guilin was a different story than Nanning. While it took 3 agonizing weeks to finally grind the 422 down in the capital and force them to surrender, in Guilin it took 2 months. That beautiful city saw some of the bloodiest and most violent days in its 23 centuries, going back to the Baiyue tribes and the Guilin commandery of the Qin dynasty. One thing about Guilin was that from the earliest moment, going back to the day Mao fired the starting pistol on May 16, 1966, it had always been an anti-Wei Guoqing hotbed and later a 422 stronghold. It had been at Guangxi Normal University in Guilin that this Guangxi Civil War had started. In June and July, when the worst of the fighting was being carried out, there were more than 10,000 fighters slugging it out, blowing each other up, shooting, hacking away. PLA arms depots were being raided by both sides in what was essentially an urban conflict. With the PLA backing up the Allied command with overwhelmingly superior firepower, the 422 faction was defeated in Guilin on August 6, 1968. This rebel faction, the darling of the Cultural Revolution group, they were wiped out. I know this wasn't exactly what Mao Zedong had in mind when he dreamed up the GPCR. Even by 1967, so early on, he saw events starting to fly off the rails. It sure did in Guangxi. The struggle sessions, the protests, the pot shots both sides took at each other, all that venom spewed at Wei Guoqing, the factional violence, and finally, after so much boiling hatred and with heads swelled with propaganda and the heat of the moment, and also, I regret to say, the nature of human beings in some situations, it traumatized the major cities and counties of Guangxi. And when it was all over for the 422 rebels in Guilin on August 6, 1968, in a way, the worst had just started to shift into a higher gear. Even with the 422 vanquished in Guilin, this raging fire still had plenty of will to burn. Allied faction supporters and fighters went out across all the rural districts surrounding Guilin, looking for any 422 remnants. A lot of hard feelings and lust for revenge, built up over the past year and more, energized these people to seek out the worst retribution. When there were no more 422 supporters to kill, the Allied members turned their focus on stigmatized families. Let me quote from Andrew Walder again. Quote, "This was a form of violence rarely seen in urban combat in its aftermath. The victims and their killers were residents of the same rural districts. Most disturbing to those who subsequently chronicled these events was the discovery that entire families were sometimes liquidated, including the elderly and small children, in acts that were at times accompanied by sexual violence, the mutilation and display of corpses, and even cannibalism." End quote. One of the reports from the investigation performed in the 1980s stated, quote, "During the few days that the massacres reached a climax, there were corpses littered all over the county seat, to the point where vehicles could not pass on the streets. Families were scattered and broken up. Some were dug up by the roots and completely eradicated. Some were plundered by the killers, so there was even no home to return to. Wives were raped by their husbands' murderers or forced to submit to them." End quote. Ever since Mao sent out that Chisan Pukao on July 3rd to restore order, the Allied command and 422 were already in the final stages of their battle. But once that notice was sent, it was like the dam broke and anybody could do anything they wanted to stamp out the entire 422 faction. All of those class enemies, foreign agents, counter-revolutionaries, and bad elements. And when they ran out of those, well, they could turn on stigmatized families and maybe even get a chance to settle an old score or two. Even without social media, it was still so easy to manipulate the people, most of them uninformed and politically naive. In a place like Guangxi in 1968, it was still very highly underdeveloped. The literacy rates were low, especially the more rural and remote one got, and most of Guangxi was rural and remote. These good folk were easy meat to get fired up and spoiling for a fight. Actually, Guangxi, historically being outside of core China, even though Qin Shi Huang set up a commandery there, it really wasn't until the Ming Dynasty that Guangxi started to become more integrated with the expanding Chinese empire. Guangxi's history is filled with rebellions pushing back on Han migrants and invaders from elsewhere, and a string of Zhuang, Miao, or Yao revolts. Guangxi was never a stranger to war and ethnic unrest. When the last death was accounted for by the authorities following the 1980s investigation, a total of 89,810 people were itemized as having died in Guangxi as a result of the violence that spiraled out of control. That number didn't take into account the people who were unaccounted for, who simply vanished without a trace, buried in some mass grave or dumped in some body of water. Had Mengzi lived to the ripe old age of 2,339, he might have looked out at what happened in Guangxi and perhaps had second thoughts about his belief in the innate goodness of all people. One of the several conclusions investigators made, who picked through the wreckage in the early 1980s, concurred those false reports that exaggerated the destruction, the arms seizures, and bold actions by 422 rebels, and some of the other lies that misled the powers in Beijing, had the desired effect. The leadership fell for it. The worst atrocities, the cannibalism, mutilations, and torture, happened in the most rural parts of the province. Why this happened? Who could have done such a thing? What drove these people to fall to this depth of inhumanity? Well, the sources I read offered a lot of insight and opinions. It's not like anti-party actors are spreading this around to smear the Communist Party. The reports are all official government-led investigations that named names, gave figures on deaths, and all the other unmentionable acts committed. The report covered the events in Guangxi up to the end of the Cultural Revolution, but it showcased everything that happened between 1967 and 1968. All these years later, we're left to ruminate about how everything might have played out had Wei Guoqing not been put in charge of the Guangxi military district and to have allowed him to go down hard like some of his other comrades did. After all, he was a cut-and-dried example of the kind of high-ranking party members Mao targeted in 1966. Well, blame it on the Americans. If not for the Vietnam War angle, maybe Mao would have viewed surrendering Wei Guoqing to the leftist rebels a sacrifice he was willing to make. We don't know. Zhou Enlai was able to use all his diplomatic and negotiating skills to come to an agreement with Nixon and the American imperialists in 1972. But when it came time to the Allied Command and 422 factions, the great premier, with all his well-known diplomatic skills, just couldn't succeed. Wei Guoqing, Wu Jinan, they came out of this bruised and battered, but were both later fully rehabilitated. In the end, 15 people were prosecuted and given 14 years, 27 party cadres, 5 party workers, 59 peasant party members were expelled from the party, and 18 others were dismissed, and 21 workers had work points reduced. Radio Free Asia had written in a 2024 article, quote, "China honors late general linked to Cultural Revolution cannibalism." The article had stated, quote, "The burial of former Guangxi leader Wei Guoqing's remains with revolutionary honors sparks horror on social media. The ruling Chinese Communist Party has enshrined the ashes of a general who presided over a Cultural Revolution massacre that included cannibalism of those deemed enemies of the people by late Supreme Leader Mao Zedong. On October 24th, officials reburied the ashes of People's Liberation Army founding general and former Guangxi Regional Party chief Wei Guoqing 35 years after his death. The news prompted outrage and satire on Chinese-language social media, with comments highlighting Wei's role in the Guangxi Massacre, in which members of factional gangs killed an estimated 100 to 150,000 people through beheadings, beatings, burial alive, stoning, drowning, boiling, and disembowelment, according to historical research." End quote. So this one ran a little long. Sorry about that. I didn't want to break it up into 2 parts. Let me mention the 3 books that I recommend if you'd like to dig deeper into this subject. I assure you, after you read any one of these 3 books, you'll think that I hardly mentioned anything in this episode. As I said, everything came from either official party documents or eyewitness accounts. Besides Zheng Yi's Scarlet Memorial, the most recently published and most detailed book about this subject was Stanford professor Andrew Walder's book, Civil War in Guangxi, The Cultural Revolution on China's Southern Periphery. UC Irvine professor of sociology Su Yang also wrote a book on the Guangxi Massacre called Collective Killings in Rural China During the Cultural Revolution. Links to all these books will be at the show notes, as they say in the biz, and there are also all kinds of reviews of all these books floating around JSTOR, Dick Writers, and Brill, and All those guys. The Guangxi Massacre is one of those chapters from the Cultural Revolution that isn't as well known, but it's been hiding in plain sight all this time, and there's lots for you to go binge on if you want to go learn more. Okay, thank you for listening, and after 15 years of presenting the China History Podcast, this is still Laszlo Montgomery inviting you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.